remember the welcome wagon? Remember the commercial? They would, yeah, they would come in and they bring the doorbell, and they would bring a neighbor, welcoming you to the neighborhood. Now this is my analogy. Twofold purpose. Get to know your neighbor, right? Then you tell them how our neighborhood runs. Okay, we don't like the paper in the yard. If you can't cut your grass, I'll cut it. Or I'll send my son over. That's being a good neighbor. But today, we have two wonderful speakers. One that I do know very well. One I just met, this handsome gentleman here. But I'm going to introduce the ladies first. That's who we are. With delicate flowers, right, girls? And that is Miss Donna O's White, and Donna is with Memphis. I'm not going to read this if you guys don't mind, because you guys can read it, okay? But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Donna from a personal perspective. We have a how-to series every month, every third Wednesday of the month at the Memphis Library. So Donna came over, and I've been telling her, I said, I want you to come and talk about neighborhoods. Just by the mere fact that that's what I do too. I work in the Office of Neighborhood Engagement, because we love people. And this work, when you're working with community, is hard work, but it's good work, right? And you have to have this thing right here for your people, or it'll tire you out and you give up. I say, people ask me all the time, well, what are you going to do about this city? We're going to die trying. That's the fight in us. That's about being a good neighbor. This lady blew my mind with her presentation. And so I was telling Paul, I said, we got to have Donna in this conversation. And because it comes from. And then our speaker here, Mr. Prentice, and please, I will jack up a name in a minute. Dantzler. Okay. Dr. Dantzler. So we feel privileged to have him here today. Austin Harrison, who worked with us on reaching out to our national speakers, really spoke very highly of him, and I am just enthused about having him here today. And he flew in, and we just appreciate you coming and sharing with the citizens of Memphis, because we're videotaping it, so it won't just be this crowd. We're going to put it out there so all of Memphis can hear it. We can connect mind to mind, thought to thought. That's the purpose.
When everybody moved in the suburbs in the 80s and 90s, now everybody's moving back to the city, right? In particular cities. And then people are moving across different cities. So while Memphis have one kind of measure as the fastest growing rental market, where I was living in Denver, it has the fastest increasing in rents in the rental market, right? So literally landlords or property managers will only confirm a rent for that day. You had 24 hours to sign a lease because the rates were changing daily. So understanding that some markets are really hot and some are a little bit slower in how they're responding, but it's also a federal position of how we actually deal with the housing crisis that's putting us in further kind of turmoil as we go forward. There's a real good book that kind of summarizes a lot of what I'm saying today, but also goes into some to a federal kind of policy called Deserving and Entitled, also by Schneider Egrom, thinking about programs and policies as a social construction, how we socially constructing these ideas. And one of the good quotes, you could look at property ownership and good citizenship are closely associated in American governance, right? So the overall kind of prevalence or focus on home ownership has had this idea that property owners are just better people in societies, they're better to keep up their neighborhoods. We understand a lot of people can't afford to buy a home. So what does that say about renters in these spaces? What does that say about people that are on some type of housing assistance, whether it be public housing, vouchers, and so on and so forth? So it's really creating a unique instance of how we think about neighborhood development or how we think about neighborhood change that outcasts renters for the sake of homeowners in this space. But not only has the government awarded property to help create the kinds of citizens it wants, it has withheld property from those constructed as undesirable, right? So we have also thinking about, in certain neighborhoods, you don't get a housing project because of the stigma related to that neighborhood. And the idea is that we can see that why development happens in certain parts of the city and not others is that there's a lot of global capital coming into cities now that wasn't the case 30 or 40 years ago, right? So it's not just like wealthy landlords in the suburbs buying properties or absentee landlords buying properties within the city limits, you have global firms coming in to buy properties because it's very cheap to do so in a lot of different cities around the country. As a result, the local governments are struggling to really battle with absentee landlords because they become the property owners, and how do you actually hold them responsible in different cases when they're just paying their usually fees over time? For most real estate investors at that type of level, it's not about community development, it's not about neighborhood development, it's a profit made off that individual object, right? So we see that the house being used as a way to actually increase wealth, and housing wealth is the largest source of wealth in this country, right? Stocks and bonds are one thing, but most people have their equity in their homes as their primary source of wealth that they're getting. So the other part is this, what I already touched upon, was this preference for homeowners versus renters. And this is like the classic case that you used to see in a lot of documents in terms of home mortgages. You'll still see these same type of kind of caricatures or pictures at credit unions, banks about, yeah, you should buy a home, you should invest in your future. And part of it is this recycling of money into debt that can become wealth. But for banks, it's a cycling of these products within the community. This has stemmed back long ago when we used to talk about living in the suburbs, right? So the suburbs were painted as a picture of like get away from the social ills of the city and go into these new communities that were planned particularly for homeowners, right? A lot of this stemmed from the GI Bill, which we also know had a racial context where a lot of black families did not have access to the GI Bill after World War II like white families did. So that's why you saw so many white families moving to the suburbs and then black families couldn't have access. So while some people wanted to stay and really redevelop their communities, the ones that did want to leave and go to the suburbs didn't have access to them overall. So you have these competing ways of how neighborhoods are changing. There's another really good book called No Place Like Home. Brian McCabe's a sociologist at Georgetown. And he really kind of tries to unpack this ideology of homeownership, right? How does this ideology of homeownership actually relate to this idea of what's a good citizen or who is a good citizen? Pouring property into this asset building that we just talked about, overemphasis on property values. So for instance, I had bought a condo in Denver in 2018, and the price, I sold it when I moved to Atlanta, or moved into Toronto. In 1 year, the price of that one condo went up $35,000 in 1 year. Condos are going up at a faster rate than housing are in most countries, across the country, where most condos are going up 10% a year, while single family homes are only going up 6% a year in values. So how we're thinking about these kind of neighborhood dynamics is really important. And it's also largely been a protection from the other, right? So whether you're thinking about low-income housing or public housing, a lot of it has been framed with this stigma about what these people would do to my property values if you let them in my neighborhood. This has been largely a white and black story, but it's also been within these racial groups too, right? So within black middle-class families or neighborhoods, and also within middle-class white neighborhoods as well. So it ends up putting neighbor against neighbor, right? So you start to see this kind of dynamic in which you kind of shift the idea of what a neighbor should be or who is a good neighbor in these communities. And the other thing is that now the interesting thing is like a lot of the American poverty is shifting towards the suburbs now. So when you see a lot of the rising housing values or costs within the central or the city limits, a lot of people that can't afford to live in the city but still work in the city are now moving to the suburbs as the next kind of capture of poverty. And this is a trend that you see happening across different cities over time. The other part, and the last part I'm going to talk to today, is think about what is affordable housing, right? So we have all these tools in a toolkit, but we're really not using them, or they tend to be very locally based or contextually based. But the government says housing is affordable if families spend no more than 30%. And as the map I showed you earlier in here, a lot of families are spending at least 30%, if not 50% or more on housing expenses. And this is outside of food, clothing, everything else, transportation costs and everything else. So you start to see the burdens that families are carrying. We have the largest kind of income inequality that we've seen, but you also have a large wealth gap, right? So it's not just having a large income or a good income that can actually maintain your lifestyle. We're not preparing you in the future in terms of how we can think about incomes changing across time. Particularly, the reason I wanted to study in Toronto, and luckily I have the chance up there, is to really think about if it's a progressive city or a progressive country, how are they shaping housing policy different? Toronto has a housing crisis too, right? So a liberal housing market or progressive housing market doesn't solve the housing crisis because there's so many factors in why that is happening. The interesting thing is that they think of housing across a continuum. So it's not just public housing, it's not just home ownership. You have to have things like shelters, or this from experiencing homelessness all the way up to market rate home ownership. And there are different tools depending on what you would use to have a more kind of cohesive kind of community or neighborhood. We don't really usually talk about emergency shelters and transitional housing for families that are experiencing some up in need at that time, right? That is another part of the housing puzzle that we need to figure out within these particular things. I would argue that most of the time we focused on these two, right? Affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership. And largely the shift to home ownership was largely pushed in the 90s. There was an overselling of it, and we saw that these families who just experienced it lost more when it came down to the Great Recession from like 2006 to 2010, and some are still experiencing that kind of thing. But what are the levers that we could use? There are a ton, right? So depending on the local context, some may be more beneficial, but also depending on the timing of the levers, some may be more beneficial, right? So California just instituted a rent control because the housing markets in most of their cities in California are absurd. So you start to think about, is that a useful dynamic? Right now in Memphis, it may not be, right? But the other things you have to think about is tenant protection laws. So I would encourage you all to look at your kind of landlord-tenant kind of regulations. What are the kind of relationship between the tenant protection laws at your local level within the particular city? How long does it take for a landlord to file an eviction? Is there an arbitrator coming in at the eviction court to try to make up some type of deal between the landlord and the tenant? These are things that other cities have employed to actually mitigate the eviction process, and some have seen some success in this space. The other thing is inclusionary zoning, right? So you can think about how can local government spur economic development within already neighborhoods that have some type of physical distress, but actually encourage densifying some particular neighborhoods, right? More public housing. We don't usually build more public housing. This is very problematic as somebody who studies public housing, right? A lot of the stigma related to demolishing it was based on this kind of construction of who was actually living there, this demonizing of who was actually living there. Public housing works if you actually fund it, right? So that was a lot of the times where we talk about public housing. It wasn't the issues of the neighborhoods being really bad, it's because federal government didn't fund the project, so the maintenance went down. These neighborhoods went down. You also disrupt and you destroy communities in and of itself, so that you have this idea of like you're constructing, promise neighborhoods, choice neighborhoods, RAD program, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. These are all programs that federal government and local governments are using, but we need to also think about how can we add more public housing into the mix. The good thing about that is it stabilizes particular communities because it's a government-owned property of land, right? Community land trust is a newer lever that a lot of people are using. This is where you take land off the private market and you use it as conservation land, right? And a lot of affordable housing complexes are using this because then you can kind of mitigate some of the market rate barriers or the increases in housing problems or values within that particular thing, so it becomes a more sustainable long-term solution. Land banks, cities like Philadelphia have been doing land banks to get some of the properties that are in deep foreclosures with absentee landlords back into the circle of the market. As a result, certain cities, I did a project in South Jersey, they made funded money at local government for local investors to actually redevelop houses within their neighborhoods. And that's a really important case of how we're thinking about how these neighborhoods are changing. It's not outside capital just coming in, but if communities are going to be in this process, you need to give them access to the capital to really redevelop or regenerate their own neighborhoods. A land value tax. Matt McCaffrey, a good colleague of mine in the room, we were talking about this yesterday, but also thinking about land value tax if it makes sense in particular neighborhoods. Low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, is another program, but we largely see that developers are taking advantage of LIHTC and not actually building enough affordable housing for the tax benefits that they're getting. So it's usually like 10 or 20% at the local level, but a lot of them are kind of outsourcing that for other reasons. Part of this is usually like an income or a rent issue or a mortgage issue. We haven't even touched the surface in terms of wealth accumulation, right? So one process is shared equity programs where you can have a community actually buy into a shared mortgage or shared equity mortgage, so they all have value increases when the neighborhood increases in and of themselves. So you have more buy-in at the local level. We have a lot of fair housing rules that we're just not enforcing, right? So discrimination in terms of rental assistance, mortgage allocation, all these other ways, we still see the same processes of kind of discrimination that we largely saw 40 or 50 years ago, but they've transformed it and kind of evolved. So we're actually doing that. And then community participation. Usually in any type of community plan, the community comes in after the decisions have already been made, usually shut out of the conversation. How can we actually have a better kind of participatory democracy in which communities are actually engaged in the process? Therefore, when development plans come in, you don't have the backlash that you see coming up in particular community meetings or public kind of meetings or public forums. I know that was a lot, but I wanted to kind of stop there in terms of, plus I want to get closer to the Q&A because I think that's where the real robust conversation comes in. So thank you for having me today.
Okay, all right. Wow. I feel like I'm back in college, and that's a good thing. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I love to find out who's in the room with me before I start talking. And so I decided to use this little board here to find out who's in the room with me. So if you are familiar with what I'm going to turn around and show you, just raise your hand. Don't say anything, just raise your hand. So the rest, the hands that aren't raised, that's about half the room. So the other half of the room is not familiar with this. So for those who raise your hands, I'm going to ask for your help. To help the rest of them who are not familiar become familiar with this. So you'll know what to do when I say, and a 1, and a 2, and let's go.
Itsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the itsy bitsy spider climbed up the spout again.
Woo! This means the fact that they knew this, and the fact that we could all I could just say, and a 1 and a 2, and everybody jump in, means that we had a shared experience at some point in our lives that has stayed with us across the years. It has never left us. We knew the words, right?
Right.
And for those of you whose hands weren't raised, I bet if we kept you in this room for about 2 more rounds of that song, that it would go with you for the rest of your lives as well. So I just wanted to illustrate with that example how easy it is to find out where people are, to find out who's in the room with you. And to say that it doesn't take a whole lot of time. So we've all been brought together by that shared experience, just of that song this morning. So I'm Donna White, and I work for Building Memphis as the Capacity Building Program Manager. Some of you may not know what capacity building is, but I want to give you a definition that I'm going to be using this morning and that I use in my work every day. So capacity building is to take actions that create, support, strengthen, and stabilize individuals, families, groups, organizations, communities, and others in ways that bring about desired change. I want to share with you today about building your capacity to know your neighbor. In order for me to share that with you, I'm going to be asking you to do some things. I'm going to be presenting to you, and for the sake of time, is there a timekeeper somewhere where I'll know?
Yes,
Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to tell you on the front end what I'm going to give to you. So I'm going to give you 4 premises, and I want you to accept them as truth. I'm going to give you 5 principles, and they would have to be adopted as a covenant. And I'm going to introduce you to 4 processes that must be activated continuously. Sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? Okay. In order to present these to you, I want to tell you a story. Once upon a time, there were places where neighbors lived. Those places were called neighborhoods. They were physical, geographically defined places that surrounded the house where the neighbors lived. But the neighborhoods were more than just the houses and streets and landmarks. People would see, hear, and talk to and interact with the neighbors who lived in their neighborhoods regularly. They recognized them. They knew their names. They had them over for dinner. Their children played games and listened to music and danced in the water spray from the sprinkler in somebody's front yard. These neighbors and neighborhoods were not just in one part of the city. You could find neighbors in all kinds of neighborhoods. Not only in the neighborhoods where homeowners lived in big houses, but also where renters lived in small apartments and housing projects. Over the years, and for many reasons, the neighbors left the neighborhoods. Others moved into the neighborhoods. But also for many reasons, they were not neighbors. They were residents. They continued to call the places neighborhoods, but they weren't. Because to really have neighborhoods, you must have neighbors. Neighborhoods only have neighbors living in them when those folks who live there are able to experience and embrace and enjoy community with one another over and over again. The end. There's a cost of not having neighbors in neighborhoods. Recently, 2 weeks ago, 28-year-old Fort Worth, Texas resident Tatiana Jefferson was shot and killed by police while in her home because the neighbor who lived across the street did not know her. 1 week ago, 3-year-old Camille Cupcake McKinney, who lived in Birmingham, Alabama, was kidnapped while she played outside after a birthday party because there were no neighbors watching out for her. Her lifeless body was later found in a landfill. This week, 20-month-old Royalty Ford from Starksville, Mississippi, was laid to rest after having been stabbed and placed in a hot oven by her grandmother with whom she lived. After the tragic discovery, neighbors reported that they had seen many of the child's toys thrown away in the garbage can in the front yard for more than a week before. That's recent. But also as far back as March of 1964 in Queens, New York, a young 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked, raped, and murdered outside her home as she returned from work in a bar. The attack occurred over a 30-minute period, and although 2 neighbors called the police and several others witnessed the attack from their windows, many others heard her cries for help, but not one of her neighbors made a move to help or rescue her. So, the 4 premises. I'm going to give you the first premise. And you have to accept these as true if it's going to build your capacity today. We have forgotten what it feels like to be a neighbor and to have a neighbor. I grew up in the Dixie Homes apartments for the first 18 years of my life. Living there helped to shape me and nurture me and protect me. I did not know that I lived in the projects until I went to high school. I just thought that I lived in a neighborhood. My neighborhood was full of neighbors, and I remember what that looked like and felt like. Premise number 2. We have lost our sense of community. Community was once where most problems were solved. Those who knew you and lived around you were the first to know your needs and come to personally help you. Community is what led you to have compassion for others, because they understood what you were experiencing, what you were going through. Snitches are an important part of the experience of community. My mama depended on snitches to be the babysitter for my brothers and sisters and me, while she worked 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. So today I want to tell you that I like snitches, and I think we need more of them today. Premise number 3. We have abandoned the notion of compassion within community. Compassion is having and showing concern for someone else's suffering. I like to say that it means coming in or joining in with someone's suffering. Sure, we give to charities and causes. We may fill the boot on the street corners or give our spare change to those with the "We'll work for food" signs. And in just a few short weeks, we will all find it extremely hard to resist the bell ringers outside of the grocery stores, the department stores, and everywhere else that cash may be available. But everyday empathy, understanding, care, concern, sensitivity, tenderheartedness, warmth, love, gentleness, mercy, leniency, tolerance, and consideration, kindness, humanity, ongoing benevolence. We don't want to live there for too many days. If I gave you money yesterday, I'm expecting you to go and find somebody else to get something from tomorrow, because I need mine, right? Premise number 4. We need to be reminded that we need one another. In the nearly 3 years that I've worked at Building Memphis, and in the 35 plus years of my work career, I can tell you without a doubt that the greatest challenge I have seen to moving the needle on the entrenched problems we have lies in our inability and unwillingness to experience and embrace and enjoy community with one another. We see the other before we see the sister or brother. We are increasingly tribal and corporate in our attitudes and our actions. You do business with buyers, right? But you're supposed to do life with neighbors. You see, one is transactional, but the other is relational. I believe that in order for us to reclaim the place of being a neighbor, the feeling of being a neighbor and having real neighborhoods, is going to require that we make a covenant with one another. We must be clear on the things that we value and that drive us in what we do and how we live. And so there are 5 principles that over the course of my career I've seen and tried to integrate into my work, and I want to give you those principles. Mutual respect, meaning that each person is valued and every voice is heard. Honesty. Truth-telling in our neighborhoods has to be foundational. That's where the snitches come in. Snitches aren't lying. They're telling what they've seen. They're giving facts. So in order for us to be able to enjoy our communities, truth-telling has to be foundational. Safety. What affects one affects all. What happens down the street or around the corner is still important to all of us. We're affected by that. Peaceful lifestyles. That means that daily consideration of others is a must. We can't just play our music, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning and say, well, I'm in my house, and even though I got the best bass sound system, and my next door neighbor's walls are shaking, that's their problem. We must consider other people in the neighborhood. And then community spirit, meaning just that we are stronger and better together. These are the 5 principles that in order for us to reclaim our neighborhoods and to really experience and enjoy community with one another, there has to be a value system that we operate by. And so I can already feel some of you in your head saying, yeah, I agree with all that, but what about the folks 2 doors? What about my neighbor? What about the folks who live 2 doors down? They're not neighbors, but what about the folks who live in the house, right? Okay? Don't even know their names, right? Well, the last thing that I want to share with you are 4 processes that I believe if we activate them continuously, that they will work to help us reclaim that which is important. I think we need to be provided with tools. You see, we want people to be neighbors, and we want to, well, let me just say it this way because my time is short. We need to be provided with tools that will help us get back our hood of neighbors that we have lost and abandoned. We haven't just lost the buildings. The buildings aren't the only things that have deteriorated, but our relationships have too. So it will not happen because we tear down old buildings and apartments and replace them with new buildings and apartments. It will not happen because we replace the people who live there with people who live somewhere else. It will not happen organically. It must be intentional. I want to just end with a few quotes that I found very interesting. This person says, we have supplanted trust and empathy with suspicion and contempt. General Mad Dog Mattis. Anybody know who that is? Yeah, I thought that was so wonderful. Did you hear me say that? So we have to learn and practice a process that helps us to act instead of react, and to be relational instead of being transactional. We must assess. This is the 4 steps. We must assess, meaning we ask the questions. We ask the hard questions. We must acknowledge what we find from that assessment and accept the answers that you get. when you assess what's going on in your neighborhood, all of it's not going to be good. Some of it will be good, some of it won't be good. But you have to acknowledge that this is what is. And then you have to come into agreement, meaning that you plan and agree on the areas that you will work to address. You're not going to turn the neighborhood around in 2 weeks or by having a fair, a health fair or a festival or any other thing, right? But you agree to plan and work on areas that you want to address. And then you align that work, meaning that you work out strategies that you will use to find solutions. And you do that over and over again. So, I want to use as my parting words. There is an insurance company commercial that I love. It says, when you are in a horror movie, you make poor decisions. Somebody else knows that. Well, I believe that we are living in neighborhoods as though we are in a horror movie. We may be surrounded by people who live in close proximity, but they are not our neighbors. And we are not experiencing and embracing and enjoying community with them. I want to challenge everyone in here today with these last quotes by Bob Goff. Bob Goff says, when you learn somebody's story, it can totally change how you see that person. And then he went on to say, we don't need to cross the ocean to love people. We just need to cross the street. So, you've got to decide what kind of neighbor you want to be. There's a no-see neighbor, which is N-O-S-E-E neighbor, or the no-see neighbor, which is the K-N-O-W-S-E-E neighbor. So I'm going to call you a snitch. But if you really want to experience and embrace and enjoy community, where you can know your neighbors, these are the ways to get you there. Thanks for your time today.
So we have about 5 minutes, and we're going to do a couple of questions for our speakers. And so anybody got a burning? Okay, Mr. Randolph.
I've done work with neighborhood associations across the city, and they vary in socio-economic status. And I'm finding it now very challenging to work in, I'm going to describe neighborhoods that I'm working in. It's a cross between low income, elderly, immigrant, transit. When I say transit, I mean renters. It's like that conflation of people just seems so hard to build that neighborhood community. So what advice do you have for me to address?
So I would advise you to say, accept that it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. Not just because of the conflation of people, groups that you're talking about, but because the society as a whole is not promoting it, does not help it. As I stated, we've become tribal. So what you're going to have to do is you're retraining people to live together in community, in neighborhoods, and experience community. Most of them, like me, I have not experienced true community since I left the Dixie homes. I've looked for it, and my socioeconomic status definitely went up, but I've not experienced that protection and safe place and nurturing anywhere else. So so there's a training that is going to have to take place with those people. And that's why I'm suggesting that there needs to be a process. Now, well, first of all, there needs to be a covenant that the people, if they're going to work to become community and become a neighborhood, become neighbors again, then they have to agree on certain value principles, whatever you all decide those are. And then you keep those before then. It doesn't happen every time you meet with them, those value principles are up. And you can even add behaviors under those value principles to say mutual respect means that we don't interrupt one another. We allow every voice to be heard. Mutual respect also means that we don't monopolize the time, right? So you can put all these different behavior directional helps there or prompts there for them as well. But it's going to be hard work because you're really changing a whole paradigm that's been going on for years and years and years.
Jumping on that. From your descriptions, I assume everyone that you're working with is generally low income, and you've got a high renter population that really, if you looked at your immigrant households and your elderly households, that would apply to this as well, right?
The elderly tend to be more own houses, so they may be a little bit cut off.
So I think that when I was hearing elderly immigrant, I was like, how do you capitalize on these two classifications that you came in? Because when I go to most meetings here, elderly people show up to everything. Like, if you need somebody to come in, it's like, you're going to have a nice, strong contingent of elderly people. Immigrants might be a little bit more difficult to find to come to community things, but if you can, I think you've got a lot of positives that you could get from an immigrant community that would help solidify your core group if you wanted to try to organize them together. So, usually, like, if your immigrant community, if everybody's already kind of living together in the same area, they might be doing their own thing that you don't necessarily know about, but if you can start pairing people up more with your neighborhood association, whoever you're working with, you have a broader coalition starting from there. Low-income renters, I couldn't really help you with, but renters, you might want to find out, are they moving because they can't renew their lease, or are they moving because they want to find a better place to live? And then you can target a strategy around keeping renters that want to stay. And you might get that by building that elderly immigrant coalition and trying to use them to drive your neighborhoods, change processes.
I have a really silly question, not silly, but I'm going back to your presentation and the continuum that you had with housing and the investments, different investments. And so one of the things that stuck out to me was social housing. I'm assuming that's public housing. Why do you call it social housing? I'm just wondering.
So that is actually a term for Canadian public housing.
Oh,
so
okay.
that's the frame of reference.
Okay.
We will call it, but in most countries they call it social housing, while in the United States it will be different. We call it public housing. Right?
Is there something that they do differently in other countries in terms of making it more so? I know it's a situation, but
So the research I'm doing right now is a couple of things, right? The reason I went to Toronto is because they have the second largest number of housing units outside of New York City for public housing, right? The other things to think about is that if we have such a racialized story of housing within the United States, I want to understand how do other countries approach housing, and it's still a racialized story. When I'm getting data from their housing authority, they don't capture race in terms of applicants, in terms of who they're, but you still see racial disparities in terms of where people are actually living, right? So while we can have these ideas, and this is like a front to Canada, but while we can have these ideas of more progressive countries, as we largely hear in political debates, they still mask a very much anti-blackness that goes on in terms of housing policy, but also how local governments actually respond to needs of communities in and of themselves.
thank you.
In your travels, have you seen them use abandoned schools for social housing?
So I'm from Philly, and I don't even think go that far, right? So a lot of the schools that the district in Philadelphia don't use anymore. So like West Philly, I grew up in West Philly. So like West Philly High is now being converted into higher income market rate apartments, right? So there are a lot of ways in which these kind of repurpose or reuse facilities in terms of schools, but also churches, also community centers. So you see, like, one, you see the demolishing of the kind of social fabric of particular neighborhoods, but there's also a repurpose or reuse of those facilities for housing purposes. The issue is that those housing purposes usually don't match the neighborhoods in which they're in, right? So like West Philly High is like $1,500 for a studio in a community where the median rent is not nowhere near that high, right? What the conversation needs to happen is that we're looking at housing as they are, but we need to understand what is the future of housing in these particular cities, right? So just like we saw cities vying for the Amazon HQ2, right? It was all of a sudden cities had money to throw into for an investment for a huge company to come in, but notoriously they've been like, yeah, we don't have any money to do this type of works. Part of it is that cities are planning for future different types of populations, right? It's notoriously seen that we don't plan for the populations that we have. We plan for particularly where we see the populations going in the future. We plan for middle income or upper income people to move into the city. We try to attract a different type of population. And city governments are like, look, we have a budget and a bottom line at the end of the day, so we need more income or more revenue. So there needs to be more attention and part of this conversation, a little bit more grace in understanding how these actual politics of community development actually work, right? Part of this other conversation that the first question alluded to is that to get communities to come together, you have to have some type of project-based thing that all community members can buy in on, right? So I'm single with no kids. I don't really care about school stuff as much if I'm renting in a neighborhood, right? But there are ways for me to buy into that as a way for our community to develop as a neighborhood overall. So let's rethink of how we're really thinking the politics of community development.
Can I say one thing to that? One quick thing is, which is great. I want to say this is that all that I was saying about getting to know your neighbors, not just for feeling good. It's because there's power, because we really are stronger and better together, and we can begin to articulate the needs of our neighborhoods better when we're not fighting amongst one another, or we're seeing others as very different from us.
I'm so sorry.
I just want to say, how can we broadcast Donna's message or build a platform for her to spread it?
We're actually videotaping this, and they will be on our website. This has been good. This gives us